Sup guys, I'm Kel, Red Zone MTG, and today I have my very first Oathbreaker deck video. If you don't know what Oathbreaker is, I did make a quick 5-minute video covering the format. Links will be in the description down below and also at the end of the video. And since it was my very first Oathbreaker deck video, I figured it would make a lot of sense to make it about my very first Oathbreaker deck. That of course is Chandra, Torch of Defiance. As you can see right here, this is my very first Oathbreaker deck. The Oathbreaker is Chandra, Torch of Defiance, and my signature spell is Price of Progress. Without further ado, let's start talking about some of the cards in the deck. So I am going to cover each individual card pretty quickly, but I am going to spend more time on others than some. More time on some than others. I could say the correct order. Anyway, we have Chandra, Torch of Defiance as our Oathbreaker. She's a fantastic Planeswalker with 4 abilities. She's a Planeswalker Chandra with 4 loyalty. She costs 2 of any and 2 red. She has fantastic artwork. Her +1, or her first +1, is exile the top card of your library. You may cast it this turn. If you don't, she deals 2 damage to each opponent, which is pretty sweet. Dealing damage to all of your opponents in a multiplayer format is quite good. Her other +1 is the one I do more often, at least right when I play her. +1, add 2 red mana to your mana pool, which is really, really sweet. That basically makes it so we can play Chandra on turn 4 and then immediately play our signature spell or any other 2-drop that we have in our hand. We'll talk about Price of Progress in a second. She also has a -3. She deals 4 damage to target creature. Pretty good removal. A lot of the creatures in this format are a little bit smaller than in Commander because this is a lot quicker format. Think of this more like Legacy or Cube than Commander. And then she has a -7. You get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, this emblem deals 5 damage to target creature player. That almost never happens in a 4-player format, but that's still worth noting. And then our signature spell is Price of Progress. Basically, this deck really wants to make all of the other decks at the table honest and fair, and I'm going to use the word fair pretty loosely because Price of Progress, as I drop it on the ground, Price of Progress is a house. It is an instant for 1 of any and a red, and it says Price of Progress deals 2 damage to each player for each non-basic land he or she controls. On turn 4, this can deal a maximum of, 8 damage to everyone is pretty good for only 2 mana. And we do have a very choice way of doubling this in the deck that I think is pretty sweet. We'll talk about that when the time comes. I really like the fact that this card punishes heavily greedy mana bases and a lot of dirtily strategies. You can't just kind of do the same thing that you do in Commander, where you just kind of build up a bunch of lands and mana and just kind of dirtle around for like 5 turns. You're going to die if you do that, especially with 4 players, and especially if people can see what you're doing. If you've got that Demonic Tutor as your signature spell and you're just kind of ramping out and dirtling around, people know that you're going to combo off soon and they're just going to kill you. And Price of Progress is one of the cards that, helps kill really dirtily decks. Alright, next up we have the creatures. We're going to start off with Grim Lavamancer, one of my favorite 1-drops. This card is just a really solid 1-drop that lets us exile 2 cards in our graveyard to deal 2 damage to target creature or player. So this card has a lot of sustain for a deck like this, which is really what we want in a multiplayer format. Cards that just kind of are 1-shot and deal damage are good, but we really need the sustain to win long games if we have to. Monastery Swiftspear is a really good aggressive card that gets bigger over time, or rather gets bigger as you cast non-creature spells. Just a really, really solid hasty 1-drop. Soulscar Mage is a really good 1-drop and also pretty good in the late game because it lets us kill big creatures with our burn spells, or at least lets us whittle them down where we wouldn't be able to otherwise, because it makes our damage, or non-combat damage, in the form of -1/-1 counters instead of just straight up damage. Also, he has prowess, which is pretty cool. Makes him good early, makes him good late. And then finally, for the 1-drop for the creatures, I run Goblin Guide. Honestly, I don't think this is very good in multiplayer. It's quite good in 1 vs 1, but this guy is probably going to get cut when something cooler comes along. And I think there's some pretty cool stuff in War of the Spark, so he may get cut, but I have one, and he's still pretty good. If you don't have a Goblin Guide, there's a ton of stuff you can swap out for this. Next up, we have some of our Punisher creatures with Eidolon of the Great Rebel. He just makes it so he domes a player if they cast a spell with converted mana cost 3 or less. And there's a lot of that going around because this is a pretty quick format. We also run Ash Zealot. 2/2 first strike, haste for 2 is quite good, and whenever a player casts a spell from a graveyard, she deals 3 damage to that player. Hoses over flashback and stuff like that. Just pretty solid body and pretty solid ability. And then we also have the Harsh Mentor. He says, whenever an opponent activates an ability of an artifact, creature, or land, if it isn't a mana ability, he deals 2 damage to that player. And that's only opponents, which is pretty sweet. Grim Lavamancer and stuff like that will not hurt us. Just keep in mind that these ones are player, so it'll hurt you. This one will not hurt you. Now, for the rest of the 2-drops, we're going to kick it off with Earth Shaker Kenra, a pretty underrated card. 2/1 haste for 2, but when it enters the battlefield, you can make a creature with power less than it not block, which is pretty cool. Makes it so they can't really chump block or anything like that. And it also has Eternalize, which means you can exile it from your graveyard for the Eternalize cost, and it comes back as a 4/4 with the same abilities, which is pretty sweet. Next we have Young Peasy. He's pretty good. He's a 2/1 for 2 that makes 1/1 elemental creature tokens whenever we cast an instant or sorcery. And we can cash those 1/1s in for damage, or we can cash them in for card draw with Skull Clamp, which I will talk about later. Next up we have Grenzo, Havoc Raiser. Really, really good card, especially with Young Peasy here. He says, whenever creature you control deals combat damage to a player, choose one. Go target creature that player controls, which basically means it has to attack, which is, you know, it's fine. He's a 2/2 for 2, also fine, but his other ability is excellent. He says, exile the top card of that player's library until end of turn. You may cast it and spend mana as though it were a mana of any color to cast it. And that's whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player. So a lot of good late game sustain with Grenzo. We can kind of like steal our opponent's best cards from the top of their deck, which is pretty sweet. Also a card that steals other cards, Dire Fleet Daredevil. 2/1 first strike for 2. When she enters the battlefield, we get to exile an instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard, and then we can cast it this turn and spend mana as though we're mana of any color to cast it. This card is awesome. It's kind of like a reverse Snapcaster Mage. We get to steal one of our opponent's effects. Really, really sweet, stealing their like cheap draw effects. Yeah, just a fantastic, good card, and yeah, nothing else to say. And then we have Firebrand Archer. I like this card a little bit more than Gutter Snipe in this deck because she's a 2-drop, which is awesome. She's a 2/1, which is pretty good too, but it says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, she deals 1 damage to each opponent, so she hits everyone, which is really sweet, instead of just one player. I find that hitting everyone is kind of a good strategy, helps you whittle everyone down at the same time, and also kind of takes a little bit of pressure off of you. You can be like, yo, I did damage to everyone, I didn't single you out, which is pretty good to be, you know, on the political side of things. Now we're getting into our mid-rangey kind of stuff. This is kind of like a mid-range red deck wins. A medium red deck, I guess you can call it. Goblin Chainwhirler, fantastic card. 3/3 first strike for 3. It deals 1 damage to all of our opponent's stuff. You know, hits their planeswalkers, hits their creatures, hits their face. Pretty good. And then we're going to keep the Goblin train rolling with Rabblemaster and Legion Warboss. These two guys basically just make 1/1 goblins every turn that have to attack, and they have some different, you know, benefits. Like the Warboss here has Mentor, which he buffs dudes when he attacks, or buffs smaller dudes when he attacks, and then Rabblemaster buffs himself for each other attacking goblin when he attacks. Once again, these cards are fantastic with Skull Clamp because, you know, we want the card draw, and the 1/1s we can cash in for stuff. Also pretty good sustain cards, I would say, because they kind of like are little armies in a can. I guess if you can call a goblin a can. Next up we have Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon. I included this in our creatures because, you know, Magus of the Moon. Interesting interaction with the Blood Moon and the Magus of the Moon. This will not affect Price of Progress. So if you cast Price of Progress, it'll still deal damage to them. Basically, it does not make non-basic lands into basic lands. It just makes them into mountains. It doesn't change their super type, just the fact that they're mountains. Which is, you know, pretty good. Once again, punishing really greedy mana bases. That's what this deck is really good at. It's really good at, you know, like I said, making everyone play an honest game. And, you know, we're playing mono red. Let's make everyone else play mono red too. And then finally, for the 3-drops, we have Imperial Recruiter, if he can get in focus. He's a 1/1 for 3, which is a pretty bad rate. However, when he enters the battlefield, we get to search our library for a creature card with power 2 or less, and then put it in our hand after revealing it. We can search up, you know, a Magus of the Moon, or a Legion Warboss, or a Young Peasy, or, you know, basically whatever. A lot of the deck is power 2 or less, and he just lets us get whatever we need for the situation. Now we're really getting into the mid-range with Hazoret the Fervent. 5/4 indestructible haste that can't attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in hand, but we can discard a card and pay 3 mana and deal 2 damage to each opponent. Like I said, dealing damage to each opponent is really good, and we will be burning through our hands pretty quickly, which is why we're going to be running stuff like Skull Clamp. Like I said, we'll get to that a little bit later. As a 4-drop, just a really, really solid card, and, you know, perfect include in this deck. Finally, for the creatures, we have our top end with our dragons and the honorary creature here, Sarkin the Dragon Speaker. These are all big 4/4 or 5/5 hasty flying dragons that help us close out the game. They all do a little bit something different, like the Thundermaw Hellkite's a 5/5 flying haste that deals 1 damage to each creature our opponents control, and then you tap the creature so you can get through. The Storm Breath is a 4/4 flying haste pro white that has this massive monstrosity cost that we really don't get to play, but yeah, it comes up every now and then. Glorybringer is excellent. He 4/4 flying haste that domes a creature if you exert it when he attacks. Pretty solid. And then finally, Sarkin the Dragon Speaker turns into a 4/4 flying hasty indestructible dragon, but he also can deal 4 damage to target creature, just like our Oathbreaker can. Just a really, really solid card. We almost never get to this this -6 here, but just a really solid card. And these are basically, like I said, our top end for the deck, how we kind of close out games when we really need to. Next up, we have some artifacts. We only run 2 in the deck, and they are very important. Skull Clamp, like I said, fantastic card, synergizes with a lot of our other cards, turns our little dudes into card draw, which we can then, you know, hopefully draw into some burn or some of our big dragons to finish the game out. Fantastic card. And then Pyromancer's Goggles, one of my favorite includes in this deck, other than being like, you know, flavor win. Pyromancer's Goggles adds 1 red mana to your mana pool, and if you spend that mana to cast an instant or sorcery spell, you know, like the one from our command zone, you can copy that spell and then choose new targets. So casting 2 Price of Progresses is pretty sweet. It's pretty backbreaking. We don't run a whole lot of instants and sorceries in this deck. Like I said, this deck focuses more on like sustain, and creatures do that a little bit better than instants and sorceries. But this is a fantastic card, and doubling our signature spell it's pretty good. Next up, we have some enchantments. This is Oath of Chandra. Once again, pretty good flavor win. When it enters the battlefield, you get to deal 3 damage to a creature, and then at the end of the turn, if a planeswalker came into the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to each opponent for only 2 mana. Pretty good. Remove something and then deal like some damage over the course of the game. If this can deal like, you know, 3 damage to a creature and 4 damage to everyone for 2 mana, I'd say that's a pretty good rate. And then we have classic mono red Sulfuric Vortex. It's 2 damage to each player during their turn, and then players can't gain life. Pretty good. Now we have our suite of instants and sorceries here. Flame Slash is one of the only ones that can't go to our opponent's dome, but 4 damage to a creature for 1 mana is a really good rate, and this can kill almost anything in the format unless our opponents are going real big. We are running Lightning Bolt because we're playing mono red. Of course, we're running Lightning Bolt. Similarly, we are running Chain Lightning. If you don't know what Chain Lightning does, because this is in Japanese, 3 damage to any target, and then that target or that target's controller can pay 2, and then copy the spell and then choose new targets, and then if they choose you, you can copy it, and so on and so forth. Most people don't. It's usually just a sorcery speed Lightning Bolt. And then we have a Rift Bolt, which is a bad Lightning Bolt, but it's still a Lightning Bolt, so we are running it. We have Magma Jet, which, you know, deals 2 damage to a creature or player, and lets us scry 2, which is, you know, not insignificant. Next up, we have Incinerate, probably the best 2 mana, deal 3 damage to a creature or player. Makes it so it can't be regenerated, which is pretty good, and this is the sweet Garfield versus Finkel, like, promo series dual deck thing, which I think is actually really cool. Next, we have Flame Rift. Pretty good rate, 4 damage to each player for 2 mana. If your opponents are running a lot of mono-colored decks, this is a really good swap for Price of Progress as your signature spell. So you can run Flame Rift instead of Price of Progress. Deals damage to you, but it's still like a 2-drop that hits everyone, which is pretty good. Next up, we have Arc Trail. This one deals 2 damage to a creature or player, and then 1 damage to another creature or player. This is a really nice 2-for-1, or at least, you know, kill your dude, ping you for 1, or whatever. Just a solid card. Abrade is another one that can't go to the opponent's dome. Deals 3 damage to a creature or destroy target artifact, which is, you know, it's pretty good. You can blow up really pesky artifacts like, I don't know, Ensnaring Bridge, just really annoying stuff. Abrade is fantastic. Exquisite Firecraft, other than featuring our hot girl, Chandra here. 4 damage to a creature or player for 3 mana, pretty good rate. But if we have 2 or more instants in our graveyard, it can't be countered, which is also really sweet. This could be a good signature spell if your playgroup runs a lot of counter spells, just to make sure that it, you know, can't be countered. And then finally, we have Fiery Confluence. This one was my signature spell originally, but I found that I like Price of Progress more because it costs 2 mana. 4 mana is actually kind of a lot. Being able to play your Oathbreaker and then the signature spell in the same turn is actually a big deal. But this card's still really sweet, so it stays in the 58. Basically, choose 3, and you can choose the same one more than once. 1 damage to each creature, so you can kind of use it as a board wipe. If this can stay in focus, you can deal 2 damage to each opponent, or 6 damage to each opponent, or destroy an artifact. Once again, artifact destruction is pretty good. Our mana base is pretty simple. Forge of Heroes, I think, is a really, really good card for Oathbreaker, if it wasn't obvious. You can give your Oathbreaker an additional loyalty counter when it comes into the battlefield, which is really sweet. And we're playing monocolor, so the colorless, not really that big of a deal. Mishra's Factory turns into a dude, so we can attack with it. Pretty good. Basically, it'll survive board wipes and that kind of stuff. If you have Mutavault, also a good inclusion. I do not have an extra copy Mutavault, so I'm running the Factory instead. Ramanap Ruins just deals damage to each opponent, which is sweet. Nephalia Academy is a metagame call for me. I play against a lot of mono black decks that like to discard stuff, and this is a really good anti-discard spell. Well, it's not a spell, it's a land. That's what makes it so good. It's just a land. So you can play it, and then your opponents have a really hard time getting rid of the stuff in your hand, because you can kind of choose where those discards go to. And then finally, for the non-basics, we have Haven of the Spirit Dragon. Why we include this should be pretty obvious if you saw the rest of the video. Basically, we can sack it and pay 2 mana and get a dragon, or an Ugin. We don't play Ugin, but we can get a dragon from our graveyard back to our hand. So this kind of, once again, gives us a lot of late game sustain. You know, when the chips are down, when you have nothing in your hand, draw the Haven, get that Glorybringer back and smack them for 4 for the win. Just a pretty easy include, and it doesn't come into play tapped, which is awesome. And for the rest, you guessed it, we run 15 mountains. Honestly, if you have an extra Wasteland or Strip Mine, they would be a pretty good inclusion into this deck. I actually have 13 commander decks, and I don't have that many Strip Mines and Wastelands, and they're kind of, you know, jumbled about through my commander decks, so I don't have any extras here, but I think they would be a really good include if you have them. And that was my Chandra Torch of Defiance Oathbreaker deck. Like I said, this was my first deck. I really like it. It really helps to keep dirtily decks honest and just kind of burn them out. It's a really fun deck. It's also a pretty inexpensive deck if you don't include cards like, you know, the Mages of the Moon and the Imperial Recruiter and Blood Moon and that kind of stuff. You could still build this for, you know, a pretty low budget, I think. Now for the next Oathbreaker video, I still have 2 other Oathbreaker decks here. The first one is this Ashiok deck, which is, you know, my second Oathbreaker deck, and it's a sweet one. And then I also have one that I'm currently building, this Garruk Relentless kind of rock-style mid-range value deck with like Tarmogoyf and really sweet recursion. Let me know which kind of deck you would like to see next as a video, Garruk or Ashiok. Also, let me know what you guys thought of the video in the description down below. Let me know if you would like to see even more Oathbreaker stuff past Garruk and Ashiok, because I really love the format, and I definitely want to make some more Oathbreaker videos. Like, comment, subscribe, all that really helps. My channel is still very, very small, and I can use all of the help. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time for some more Magic the Gathering content.